Hi, and welcome back to the Pilot Factored. Today we'll dive into fatigue, the definitions of it, how they're defined by the ICAO, FAA, Transport Canada. Moving on from there to a little bit more practical aspect of things, what causes fatigue? And to understand that, we'll need to explore sleep, define it, understand what cycles of sleeps are in, and from there on, we'll finally explore how fatigue affects us and how we can fight it effectively. So as a North American operator, I'm going to focus on the definitions of fatigue by the FAA and Transport Canada. But before that, we're going to take a bigger step back and look at the ICAO's definition of fatigue. So as the overarching authority for aviation in the world, ICAO defines fatigue as a physiological state of reduced mental or physical performance capability resulting from sleep loss, extended wakefulness, circadian phase and or workload, mental and or physical activity that can impair a person's alertness and ability to adequately perform safety-related operational duties. Wow, that was a mouthful. Um, but the big thing here to take away is that the ICAOs, or the International Civil Aviation Organizations, definition is sort of the most balanced of all the definitions. As we look at the FAA and Transport Canada's definition, we'll see why. But this one draws a clear picture of what happens when you are fatigued, mental impairment, and the reduced ability to perform safely. But it also goes beyond that and explains why you are fatigued, sleep loss, and or extended wakefulness. Now let's look at the FAA's definition. Fatigue is a condition characterized by increased discomfort with lessened capacity for work, reduced efficiency of accomplishment, loss of power or capacity to respond to stimulation, and is usually accompanied by a feeling of weariness and tiredness. Now, the FAA definition, of the Federal Aviation Agency's definition, takes us a bit deeper into the effects of fatigue at the expense of the causes. It actually defines what the ICAO mentions as mental impairment, lessen mental capacity, and reduce efficiency. So in other words, our brain requires more concentration to fly effectively at the expense of our remaining cognitive ability for decision making. Now let's look at a final contender here, Transport Canada's definition of fatigue. They're pretty Spartan here, a little bullet point list, a state of physical or mental weariness that results in reduced alertness. The result of a lack of adequate sleep, and finally, a sleep that accumulates until paid off with adequate sleep. Now, Transport Canada swings far to the other side here. It tells us in a very short words what happens when tired. However, the definition tracks down the root cause instead, an imbalance between wakefulness and sleep. So what is fatigue? Let's define it a bit better. Did you know that the average adult needs between 7 to 9 hours of sleep a day? However, we typically get between 5 to 7 hours of sleep a day here in North America. That leaves us with a problem. Attaining less than this 7 to 9 hours of sleep a day creates a sleep debt. The two leading causes of sleep debt are defined as acute sleep deprivation and chronic sleep deprivation. Acute sleep deprivation can be explained as caused by short-term sleep debt. An example of this will be pulling an all-nighter, for example. The remedy is pretty simple: acquire an equal amount of sleep as to that which was lost. So if you work all night, next day just sleep longer and make up what you lost in sleep. You've paid off the sleep debt. However, chronic sleep deprivation is a bit more complex than this. It is caused by long-term sleep debt, which, for example, could be explained as multiple short nights in a row, or insomnia, or fragmented sleeps. Now, if you're a parent like me, you know that getting multiple short nights in a row is something that's very easy to do, with little ones waking you up earlier than you could imagine. Insomnia can be caused by all sorts of trouble. It could be caused by overweight, by some other medical issues. And finally, fragmented sleep is a problem that can come, for example, from drinking too much alcohol before going to bed. Quick remedy to this, well, not quick, but a remedy to this would be multiple good successive nights of uninterrupted sleep to regain the balance. Now, that means that's a lot of work and dedication to really go after regaining that sleep, paying off that debt, and it will take many nights. So whether it's work related or family related or anything like this, you need to make an intentional effort into repaying the sleep debt. Another cause of fatigue in the aviation world, or if you travel extensively, for example, you'll be familiar with the word jet lag. Now, I like to also call it time zone whiplash, depending on how fast we go. But anyhow, jet lag is often enemy number one for most long haul pilots and seasoned travelers, and probable cause for severe sleep deprivation, both short and long term, if you don't manage it properly. Jet lag results from a misalignment between the external environment and the internal body clock. Um, what we call the biological clock or the body clock is a mechanism underlying the circadian rhythm. And research shows that this little biological clock is located in a tiny nucleus in the hypothalamus, a gland in your brain. Now, moving on with this. Our master clock is busy coordinating body functions, including temperature, blood pressure, and hormone production over a 24-hour cycle. In average, that clock can withstand about 1 hour's displacement a day. So if you cross more than one time zone, this is where the problems start to happen. Extended duty day can also contribute to fatigue. It often takes the following form, for example, 12-hour duty day or plus. I've hit 15, I've hit 21 on extended with added crew. Or another example could be a late duty start after multiple hours awake. So once again, you spend the whole day awake, doing your work around the house, and all of a sudden you get the call out at 9 p.m. that there's a flight and you gotta go. Depending on if you're flying charter or airline, they may look different, but they often take a very similar approach or similar effects anyhow. So our internal body clock, as we said, is actually a cluster of 20,000 neurons located in our brain near optic nerve. Fun fact. Now, time for a little trivia. Did you know? Cue the music. A NASA study revealed that 4 out of 5 pilots have unintentionally fallen asleep. So what is fatigue? To understand fatigue past just what it is in a couple of words, let's look at the symptoms of fatigue, how they truly affect us. So typically, symptoms of fatigue will fall into 3 categories. They'll be seen as a deficit between 20 to 50%. Now, these are numbers, but take it as it goes. 20 to 50% deficit of physical, mental, and emotional aptitudes. Physically, you'll see reduced coordination, slower reaction times, apathy, microsleeps. Mentally, you'll see attentional lapses, diminished judgment, lack of concentration, reduced memory, tunneling. And emotionally, well, we all know how it is to feel tired. We're short-circuited. We become irritable. There's inability to communicate clearly, more affected by stress, and our decision making becomes more emotions based than fact based. Now, when it comes to inability to communicate clearly, it doesn't only mean, for example, not being able to find the right words to say what you want, things like this. Believe me, I used to work night shift for ambulance, and one night one of my colleagues was trying to ask me a question, and she had to ask me 3 times until finally she said, "Dude, you're like mumbling. I cannot understand what you're saying." And in my head, everything I was saying was absolutely clear. I didn't have any trouble verbalizing it, but it just wasn't coming through. And I realized that in my half asleep state, I had to make a real effort to speak up clearly so that they could understand me. So sometimes inability to communicate clearly can just be, a little bit physical too. But so keep that in mind. So it's useful sometimes to use some more objective tools that will allow us to kind of put on a number or in words how fatigued are we. One of those is called the Sam Pirelli, I hope I'm pronouncing this right, scale. This, along with the Karolinska sleepiness scale, are two tools that are often used or suggested to pilots to use. So let's take this one, for example. You have a scale here of tiredness, and you can see that as we go through the day, the numbers increase. Okay, noon, you're at 2. 3 p.m., you're around 2. 6 p.m., or you're at 3. 9 p.m., you're up at 5. And midnight, you're up at 6. And as you go down the scale, you can see, okay, well, the scale goes from fully alert, wide awake, to completely exhausted, unable to function effectively. These can be used sort of as a guidelines to help us figure out where we fall if we don't know where to begin. Trivia number 2. Did you know that being awake for 17 to 18 hours can cause mental impairment equivalent to a blood alcohol level of 0.05%? Now, this may not seem like much, but the legal limit at which you could be charged for DUI in many countries is equal to that number. So what is sleep? To understand the correlation between fatigue and sleep, we need to understand the structure of sleep. Sleep is divided in rhythms and cycles. It's characterized by a cycle of partial or complete unconsciousness called the sleep cycle. The cycle, which typically lasts between 90 to 115 minutes, so between an hour and a half to almost 2 hours, is divided into 5 phases. Stage 1 is drowsiness. The first 5 to 10 minutes of sleep where you're actually just falling asleep. This is transition between wakefulness and sleep where the brain produces theta waves. Stage 2 is what we would call light sleep. It lasts about 20 minutes. So after just falling asleep, you fall into a light sleep stage and your brain starts to produce rhythmic brain waves known as sleep spindles. Your body temperature actually starts to decrease and heart rate slows down. Enter stage 3, moderate sleep. The brain starts to produce deep and slower brain waves called delta waves. Finally, we're in stage 4, deep sleep. A very deep sleep that lasts about 30 minutes. Muscle and tissues repair during that time. In stage 5, called REM sleep or rapid eye movement sleep, muscles become more relaxed while the brain system is more active. Dreaming occurs during stage 5 because of the increase in brain activity and the temporary paralyzation of voluntary muscles. Now, our muscles will be twitching. That's when, you sleep and you start talking in your sleep and you start, tossing and turning in your sleep. A note here is that if you were woken up during stage 4, deep sleep, you would experience what's called sleep inertia. That's when, for example, you take a nap and you take an hour-long nap, for example, you'll wake up so groggy and feel miserable because your brain was in deep sleep and it's going to take it. Basically, the remainder of the time of that sleep cycle. So if you get woken up at 60 minutes mark or 70-minute mark, it will take you between 20 to 30 minutes to finally fully recover from the sleep inertia because your brain is just going to try to get out of there, but it's going to take it a while. So we'll talk about that and very shortly. Now, microsleep is another sleep cycle, and we talked about, pilots falling asleep unintentionally in the cockpit. It could take that form. Most of the time, that's the form it'll take. Another word for that would be hitting nails or nodding off. There are other expressions for this little-known sleep cycle called microsleep. Lasting anywhere from 1 to 30 seconds, microsleep are typically unintended. They're characterized by the loss of attention, blank stares, or prolonged eye closure. The person eventually goes unconscious only to snap back awake or wake up without even knowing that they were asleep. This is because the brain can only remember sleep that lasts for more than 2 minutes. So every time that you're in a cockpit or you're in a car even, or any situation, let's say you're watching a movie and you snap back awake, you've just entered microsleep and woken up again and didn't even realize it. And these are the most dangerous ones because you don't know you're falling asleep. Your eyes may be staying open, things like that, but your brain just kind of shuts down for a few minutes, or a few seconds, I should say, and anything could happen during that time. So a good night of sleep then is a proper number of sleep cycles, which will allow you to reach the desired 7 to 9 hours of sleep, as we mentioned before, required for your body to rest for proper operation. So what is sleep? Sleep is a state into which the body enters to restore and rejuvenate the following. It uses those 5 cycles to restore your nervous system, your muscular system, your immune system, skeletal system, and so much more. This is called the circadian rhythm. If you didn't know, circadian is from the Latin words circa, which means about, and dies, which no, does not mean to die, but a day. Carpe diem, dude. So the circadian rhythm is a natural internal process that regulates the sleep-wake cycle and repeats roughly every 24 hours. Although on this slide, it shows the sleep cycle as beginning around 11 p.m. and going into only one uh, cycle of restorative sleep, deep sleep, REM sleep, and so on. This is only here to show that your sleep, your 7 to 9 hours of sleep period here, will incorporate these cycles, which we know to take between 90 to 115 minutes. Zeitgebers, or another word, time givers. The biological clock for most humans operates on a cycle of about 25 hours. Now, you're wondering now, why is he mentioning 25 hours when just a slide ago he was saying 24 hours? Well, under ordinary circumstances, the clock is reset by about 1 hour each day, such that the biological clock is synchronized with the 24-hour solar day. The cues that serve to reset the clock are called Zeitgebers, a German word that means time givers. Morning sunlight, for example, is the most important Zeitgeber. Other cues that may serve as Zeitgebers include work-sleep schedules, eating schedule, social activities, and in the absence of other cues, well, subtle environmental factors such as building vibrations and even traffic noise. Now you can see that our clock can reset itself by about 1 hour each day. Although that can be routinely reset every day, it cannot easily and quickly be reset by the large time quantities that are needed to follow or following significant changes in work or sleep schedules or a transmeridian flight, which would, for example, induce jet lag. The slow adaptation of the circadian clock contributes to problems in conducting night operations and those flights, for example. So outside of our regular 7 to 9 hour sleep or night, there are other ways or other tools that we can use to regain sleep or counter fatigue in some very strategic ways, for example. If you find yourself following a short night or early morning, having to reset your sleep a little bit or counter some fatigue that is sneaking in, there are rules typically in manuals that allow for such thing as controlled rest. Um, or napping is another word for it. And napping can take many forms depending on the need. So controlled rest will be very clearly outlined in your manual as to how long is allowed and how it is to be done. However, napping outside of the cockpit can take many forms. Let's talk about a few. The first one is your 10 to 20 minutes nap. It's very short. It limits you to the very lightest stages of sleep and removes the threat of sleep inertia. The 26-minute nap, or the NASA nap, in other words, because it was researched by NASA, has shown to improve performance by up to 34%. They really like those numbers, and alertness by 54%, whatever that means, according to their research. Now, in simpler terms, this was designed as the end-all be-all of all naps, if you can actually time your sleep to 26 minutes. 30 minutes can cause sleep inertia because of entering the third sleep stage, for example. So at first, you'll wake up from your 30-minute nap. You'll feel a bit groggy, but the benefits will kick in a bit later. They'll still be there. 60 minutes is best for improving memory capabilities because it allows for deep sleep, but do expect, again, that sleep inertia to set in afterwards. 90 minutes is basically a full sleep cycle, improves memory and creativity while avoiding sleep inertia because now you're waking up at the end of the cycle, hopefully, which will really limit the impact of that inertia on your body, on your brain. Now, there's one more in there that I like to call the coffee nap, which is about a 20-minute nap. They say it takes about 20 minutes for caffeine to kick in. So, in theory, if you can down an espresso or a cup of coffee, lay down and fall asleep on the command, you should be able to wake up 20 minutes later with caffeine kicking in, feeling like $1,000,000. I can't fall asleep so fast, so it's never worked for me, but let me know if it does work for you. Oftentimes, during a long flight or even shorter flights, but in phases of flight that we're really used to or that present no danger or challenge, it's easy to fall into what we call complacency. Now, enter fatigue, and it's doubly so because not only are we very kind of sluggish and not paying attention, but we kind of rely or fall back on just habits to carry us through without really paying attention to the small details. Complacency is caused by the very things, in fact, that should prevent accidents, factors like experience, training, and knowledge. We'll fall back onto those and think that we're good enough to manage whatever comes up. It's also described as a mental state where an aviator, or put in whatever place of work you're in, acts unaware of actual danger or deficiencies. So how do we avoid complacency? Well, as Chris Hadfield would say, sweat the small stuff. Be mindful of every little detail. Train and aim for precise execution. If you're always paying attention, if you're always thinking about the little things rather than just saying, well, it's fine, it'll sort itself out, but instead really managing things as they're going on, you'll gain much better grasp on the situation if any danger were to happen. Visualizing failure is another thing. Knowing everything that could harm the safety of a flight, you can prepare contingencies and work towards solutions faster. Now, what that means is, for example, before a takeoff, the importance of a good briefing will come in where you will visualize what could happen in the case of an engine failure, in the case of a fire, in the case of an emergency evacuation. These are the steps we will be taking. And by briefing them and preparing for them mentally and rehearsing them in your mind's eye, you'll be more ready were they to happen than if you just said, ready for takeoff, let's go. So as we just said, planning and briefing thoroughly will be a key tool against complacency and potential dangers of operating while fatigued. By defining clear parameters and subsequent actions, much of the decision-making process is eliminated. You plan it, you brief it. If it happens, you act upon it without having to make a decision or a call on it. Now, how do you brief effectively? Keep to the ABCs. Pretty simple. Make it appropriate, brief, and concise. However, be mindful of details. When you brief, as when you train, aim for precise execution. Define precise parameters. This will reduce errors, which in turn can generate threats. Now, before we break, take a moment to review the questions in the description below. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out and I'll be happy to answer them.